Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. And of course, that's not Maharaj's only introduction. Maharaj, through his wonderful lectures, his articles, books, has inspired thousands of people to take up Krishna Bhakti for many decades. So we are extremely grateful that Maharaj, out of his really busy schedule, he spared some time for us, and we are really excited for that. So thank you very much, Maharaj, for joining. So today's topic that I thought of is discussion on. Last time there were some questions on problem of evil, and then today's topic that we thought of is a discussion on hermeneutics. So maybe I don't know how to merge them together, but maybe I can start with a question that may lead to
Yes, we
focused.
we just go with the flow.
Yeah. So, so personally, for me also, and for many of my friends, and even those who are trying to approach religion and spirituality from a kind of secular background, or so to say, secular background with training in science and philosophy. So it's really the first thing people encounter about God is the issue on problem of evil. So if the perennial discussion on if God is all good, all benevolent, all perfect, omniscient, then why he can allow evil in this world? So that's a problem. Not only it has been raised many centuries back, but still in recent times also, even the mainstream, so to say, the atheist, maybe militant atheists, I would say, people like Richard Dawkins and all. So this is one of the primary arguments they give before for their for supporting the thing that God doesn't exist. So how can, as a practitioner, like you who have been practicing for many decades, so and inspiring many others, so how would you answer this question that if God is all good, then how he can allow evil in this world of many sorts?
Yeah. Yes. Well, first I want to say thank you again for this opportunity to be with you, and I also want to say, since this question has been persistent over centuries, if not millennia, please don't expect a definitive answer from me, from this little Swami. But I may be able to help us think more about the question and what would be the implications of how we might answer it, or if the questioning leads us into deeper questioning. I mean by that, it seems to me when we're trying to contemplate ultimate truth, ultimate reality, the first thing we have to do is confront our insignificance, how small we are, how small our capacities are, how little we know about anything. I don't have the exact quote, but it's been said that we are sitting on a small island of knowledge surrounded by a sea of, not ignorance, but a sea of unknowing. In other words, we know a few things, but compared to what we don't know, it is infinitesimal, what we know.
Right.
And we try to extend our knowing, our comprehension, with our philosophy and with our theology and so on. But as we stretch ourselves mentally and intellectually and spiritually, what we invariably find is there are limits. We come to some limit in our understandings, beyond which we know there is more to comprehend, but we are not in a position to comprehend. That's one general comment, but on the other side, we have Krishna's statement in the Bhagavad Gita that one who knows him, Krishna, knows everything.
Mm.
And how do we know the Supreme Personality of Godhead? How do we know the Lord? Krishna explains that also, that we know the Lord by devotional service. Bhaktyamam avijanati yavanyaschasmi tattvata. Tattvata, we can know the Lord in reality, bhaktya, by means of bhakti. And so that gives us hope that we may be able to comprehend the Lord and His ways. And of course, we make a presupposition when we agree to practice bhakti, and that is that the recipient of our bhakti actually exists, and that he or she, or combination of both, are conscious, are able to, are aware of our devotional activity. So that's a presupposition, which the question, how is it possible? It's a question which is very understandable, and at the same time we want to recognize it comes from a position of skepticism. And there are different degrees of skepticism. There's what's called sometimes radical skepticism, which means no matter what you say about something, there will be another doubt that comes. And so you get infinite regress of doubting as the sort of base position, which René Descartes, the French philosopher of the 17th century, he tried as best he could to get to the bottom of doubting, to try to find something certain, to find some certainty. And the only certainty he could find was that he exists.
Otherwise, all his speculations carry no meaning. Yeah.
Well, he understood, oh, I'm doing all this doubting. So this doubting is going on. So that's only possible if I exist. And so, cogito ergo sum, I'm thinking, therefore I'm existing. That's about as far as he got, it seems. He was actually theistic, though. He believed in the existence of God, and he had arguments for why he believed, or why it's rational to believe in the existence of God. The question, if God is all good, How is it that we see evil is questioning the existence of God. It's basically saying, A, we see and we experience evil, and B, the claim that there is an all-good God is inconsistent with our experience. It's inconsistent with what we see and what we experience and what others see and experience. It's inconsistent. Why? Because we make an assumption, and that is that God, if God exists, he must be all good, and all good must mean that there would be no evil, or what we perceive as evil. And what seems to be necessary to go deeper into the question is to ask ourselves, first of all, what do we mean by God, and what do we mean by all goodness, and then what constitutes evil? And a general point, I think, that can be safely made about the atheist position that says, since we see that there is evil, and since we understand God, if he exists, must be all good, and therefore would not countenance the existence of evil, therefore God does not exist. Excuse me, I believe that there is a presupposition here on the comprehension of God. There is a limited understanding of what or who is God. And that limited understanding of God is usually based on, for those sort of, I call them born-again atheists. The modern scientistic argument against the existence of God seems to be based on certain very simplistic ideas of God rooted in the Abrahamic traditions, or their understanding of what the Abrahamic traditions are. But if we take the Abrahamic traditions, we can take in from the Hebrew Bible, the so-called Old Testament of the Christians. There's the book of Job. The book of Job tells a story which is that God has a wager with Lucifer, with the fallen angel, to test the devotee of God named Job by taking everything away from him, taking his health, his wealth, everything from him, and to see what is his response. And Lucifer, the devil, is saying, you will see that he will no longer be your follower. He will no longer be devoted to you. And God is sort of wagering, no, he is a very serious devotee. He will pass all the tests. I'm telling this story simply, but it's a very famous story, and it's considered one of the most beautiful parts of the Bible in terms of the language, the literary quality, and so on. Anyway, and huge number of commentaries have been written just on this one book. So step by step, everything is taken away from this apparently successful, wealthy person. He has a nice family and everything is going well for him, and suddenly everything goes wrong for him. And then it gets worse, and it gets even worse, and it gets even worse. And he's in a totally desperate situation, and he's really wondering, God, why have you done this to me? And then the dramatic moment in the story comes. God speaks to him sort of out of the thunder, out of the sky or something, and thunders at him that basically, who do you think you are to presume to have any understanding about who I am? Again, he speaks in very poetic, kind of very powerful ways, but basically that's, as I understand, that's the message that he's making, is that you're making an assumption about who I am, about God, which is based on your very limited perception, and that's your mistake. And so you need to wake up and just acknowledge that you're actually dealing with someone who is so much greater than you can ever imagine. And he asks him, I remember now, rhetorically, God asks Job, where were you when I created the world? So, how can you even begin to understand the power of God? How can you begin to understand the nature of this world? You were not there. You are a product of this world. So get humble. He's already been made completely humbled, and God is telling him, you're not humble enough yet. Anyway, that's the point being that often the criticism or the atheist claim, there cannot be God, seems to be based on a very limited notion of God, and that limited notion seems to come especially from a limited understanding of the Abrahamic tradition's understanding of God.
Yeah, so you mentioned the kind of infinite goodness of God, and so as I understood, so the goodness of God also includes evil. Is that correct? How does one reconcile? The goodness of God also containing the part of evil as a quality. In the sense.
Well, here we may want to resort to our own Vaishnava way of expressing it in terms of light and dark, where the dark is the absence of light. It's not in opposition to darkness or in opposition to light. It's in opposition to, it's not in opposition, it's just the absence of light. And so we understand the analogy is given that God is like the sun, and Maya, illusion, or dark, is compared to darkness. And where there is the light of Krishna, there's no question of the darkness of Maya. The idea of evil, again, this is a very Abrahamic notion. Okay. Evil. And it ties in, I would say, very much with the Abrahamic notion of sin. But sin is, I don't know, the original derivation, I think it has to do with the idea of turning away from God, which we understand also very, very much. but we usually speak of this in terms of ignorance rather than sin.
Right.
I had one professor of Indian religions who used to joke because he himself was from a Christian background, and he sometimes would say, actually, I'm kind of a Christian Buddhist. He was inspired also by some aspects of Buddhism. But anyway, he said, in Christianity, they say that there is what is called original sin.
Right.
This is actually an idea that came, I believe it was promoted by St. Augustine in the 4th century, that all of the suffering and misery and evil that we see in the world is due to this original sin which came soon after creation, and which is described in Genesis as disobedience to God, who specified a certain rule that you can enjoy this garden, the Garden of Eden, but do not take any fruit from this one tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And of course, they were persuaded. So the story goes, it's a bit misogynist, perhaps, that it's Eve, the woman who submits to the temptation. But this professor I had used to say, well, they say original sin, but in India you would say original ignorance. It's not sin so much as ignorance. But maybe it comes to the same thing, because in English, to ignore someone is to, turn away and act as if the person is not present.
Right.
Where were we? So,
Yeah.
Is evil within the goodness of God? We might say that, but I'm not sure what that idea illuminates to say that. Of course, one thing it might tell us is it might point to the notion of education, the idea that everything that happens in this world is for our education.
So God has a purpose.
Yeah, he has a teaching purpose, didactic purpose, which, yeah, our Srila Prabhupada would speak like that. He would say the material world is a prison, and a prison is for punishment, but it's also for rectification, and rectification suggests education. But it persists in being an intriguing question: why evil, or why the incredible suffering that there is, especially when we feel that we see persons who, from all evidence, are innocent, and then they have to suffer. So the answer that our tradition gives is you have to look beyond the present life. You have to go to previous lives, and that means you have to acknowledge what is called karma. There is action which has reaction, and that this holds up from lifetime to lifetime. We may say this is completely sensible. It has its own challenges because, first of all, if it's a process of learning, of education, generally when you are punished for something, you are informed what you're being punished for.
Right.
And so the argument goes, how do I know what it is I'm being punished for? I don't remember what I did in my previous life for which I'm being punished now. To which one possible answer, although how convincing it is to someone is a question, but a possible answer is you may not be fully conscious of the reason, but you on some level you do know, and you may not know the particulars of what you did, but because Paramatma is there, and you are associated as Atma with Paramatma, and Paramatma remembers, so you are being given a lesson in such a way that it doesn't depend on the particulars of whatever you've done, but it will be learned so that you will not do the same again. That can be one argument.
Yeah, right. So for atheist, actually, the problem is probably somewhere else, because for him, like, if we need to explain, we have so many theological ideas to bring in. So an atheist, he is not ready to imbibe so much of theological baggage. So for him, there is no even afterlives. There is he's just questioning the existence of God, and he's not willing to accept life beyond this current life. So any kind of reward or punishment is something becomes really superfluous when when it spans over many lives, or not necessarily restricted to this one life. So
yeah,
that
but
is,
we would I think one would want to point out that to not accept that is means there are some presuppositions there,
right.
and there's a metaphysical. It's taking a metaphysical position which is not automatically.
Granted by the, yeah,
It's not necessarily the case.
right.
It's based on the notion that ultimate truth is reducible to physical matter, and this is very very much questionable, and it has been and continues to be questioned. The case for ultimate truth being reducible to matter depends on what Prabhupada called the what was it, a check which is not a post-dated check. Yeah, that's it. We will in the future find this and that and the other thing.
Right.
Incidentally, you may find it interesting. I was reminded that Srila Prabhupada, today I read this, that in a morning walk, I think it was, in Los Angeles, maybe 1973, Srila Prabhupada was speaking with some devotees, including scientist devotees. And he was speaking about their mission. He said that that our worship of Krishna is our internal affair, and to preach that life comes from life, this is our external business. This is our public business. So he kind of boiled down to two principles, internal and external. And I think what he was saying is, don't get them mixed up. Don't expect the skeptical scientists and whoever to first accept Krishna.
Yeah.
Just Just start with life comes from life. Do you accept this or not?
And a prerequisite to all of spiritual science. Probably because of that only Bhagavad Gita starts with an understanding that you are not limited to this life, you're eternal beings. So
Yeah, that's lesson number one.
yeah. So I would request all the participants, if they have any questions, they can type in the chat box. I'll try to integrate them in my questions. If time permits, we can allow you to directly ask also, no problem. So, so maybe we can make a little detour, maybe in a guided detour, in the sense we are talking about interpretation of the original sin, different sections you quoted from Hebrew Bible. And here the question really comes, I mean, who really grants the authority to kind of interpret, in the sense, where does really the meaning lie? Is it really in the text, or is it really cooked up from the mental stage of a person, or maybe realization, if you would like to say, for a spiritualist? So where does the meaning really lie? I mean, who grants the authority to, for what purpose, to really give a interpretation? The same, in the Bible, as far as my little reading. So the Genesis, in the whole six days or so, the whole creation happened, or things like the earth is flat, and many such things, and similar such things also come in our tradition, and not only our, everywhere. So how like, there is one way to interpret these things with faith as an insider, but what we are really interested to understand is, as an outsider, like a skeptic, who is not really going to, who is not sure of whether God exists or not, whether afterlife exists or not, whether this whole theological enterprise is true or not. So for an outsider who is looking beyond the tradition, who is not himself a practitioner, so for him, such kind of text, which is not really matching with modern day understanding, so it posits a big challenge. So when people question the authority of this text, which really carry the baseline of any kind of further discussion on anything spiritual, so no matter how much we take, so the main question is, where does the really meaning lie? I mean, and what grants the authority for the interpretation? I mean, would you like to answer in some?
I will try to say something.
Yeah, I face this question over and again from my friends and colleagues.
So, Srila Prabhupada, as you, I'm sure, know, met this one professor in Moscow in, I believe it was, Kotovsky, in 1972, perhaps. And one of the points that he made in their discussion was that you are accepting authority, I am accepting authority. Let us acknowledge that we are both accepting authority. And this is already something difficult for this, for the more hardcore materialist, because we may not want to even use the word materialist because it has some very negative baggage. Maybe just naturalist is a more general term. So the naturalist will be skeptical and say, I don't accept authority. I accept my own perception, my own reason, perhaps a combination of both, or one over the other, and that's been a debate in Western philosophy between the empiricists and the rationalists. But I think we want to look, because you mentioned the word authority several times. What's the authority for interpretation? And I think the first step is to say, well, let's recognize that we always follow authority.
Mm.
We may have different authorities.
Right.
That's all right. A second point is to recognize, and this is mentioned in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 17, Shraddha Mayo Yang Purusho, Yo Yat Shraddha Eva Sa. Everyone has Shraddha, everyone has faith. That faith may be this quality or that quality, this directed this way or that way, but some sort of faith will always be there. In the context of 17th chapter, it's faith in terms of the modes of nature. But just taking the general point that there is faith,
Mm.
and that everyone has it, including the atheist.
Right.
The atheist's faith is that there is no God. But the question comes then, if there's no God, then who is the authority? That means you're making yourself the authority. But why should we accept you as authority? Then the burden of proof goes on such a person to accept their authority, as opposed to, for example, the authority of Bhagavad Gita, which is being read and studied since thousands of years.
Right.
Okay, that's one point. Then accepting that we do follow or we accept authority, then your question is how, in terms of interpretation, and interpretation is about interpreting, well, broadly speaking, semiotics would be the broad topic of signs that are then interpreted by one who perceives a sign. More specifically, maybe language is a subset of semiotics, of signs. And more specifically, then the question is, what text are we considered worthwhile to interpret?
Right.
And that's where we come pretty quickly to the whole subject of epistemology and how do we determine pramana and so on. And there even in that sphere, you come to different ideas about interpretation. But if we look at the Vedic tradition, broadly speaking, the whole branch, the entire darshan of Purva Mimamsa, Mimamsa is the general term, more specifically, Purva Mimamsa is usually used to speak about sometimes karma Mimamsa, but there's Purva and there's Uttara Mimamsa. Mimamsa can be translated as deliberation, but one of the major specific concerns of the Mimamsakas was how to understand the meaning of the Vedic texts, specifically the early Vedic texts, the texts involved in the practice of ritual. And the Mimamsa Sutra, the very first foundational text, begins, as I remember, atato dharma jigyasa. Now is the time to understand dharma. And it makes the argument right in the beginning that we have to recognize that there is a sphere of knowing which is inaccessible to us as human beings, inaccessible to our senses and inaccessible to our reasoning. And that sphere of knowing is called dharma.
Okay.
And so what it's saying is there's something that's beyond our capacity, our limited worldly capacity, and we have to accept, and that's authority.
Mm.
And so then it becomes very important to make sure one is understanding that authority, that as it's given in the texts, that one's, getting the message,
Mm.
right? And so they go into elaborate explanations about how processes for interpreting. In particular, there's the Shat Lakshana, the 6 different features of a text by which you can detect, you can analyze the meaning of a text from the beginning of the text, the end of the text, what's original, what is repeated, what is praised, and so on. But they're also concerned about how language works. The Mimamsakas became very concerned that because interpretation of language, okay, so then how does language work? And it's the Mimamsakas who made the claim, which was quite radical, that the Veda is apurusheya.
Mm.
And they meant this very literally. We sometimes hear in the Vaishnava tradition, yes, Veda is apurusheya, but it is spoken by God, by Vishnu, by Narayana.
That's right.
But the strict Mimamsakas would reject that.
Okay.
They would say, no, 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 no. Apurusheya means no person, no divine person, no any kind of person
Okay.
has given Veda. Why? Because it's always there. And their argument seems to be something like, try to show that that's not true.
Right.
They just, it's your problem. They put the burden of
Yeah.
um,
Bounce back.
of falsification on someone who doesn't want to accept that.
Yeah, probably rejection is a bit more easier than assertion because
Mm,
whatever you claim, we can easily reject, prove that.
yeah,
So that's
but here also, I mean, here this is a point that I can't say with certainty, but it's something that I've been reflecting on, based on something that our Srila Jiva Goswami says, which is that the Veda that we presently have
Mhm.
is actually only a fraction of the original Veda. And to me, that suggests something interesting, which is, could it be the case that all of the sacred literature of the many different traditions of the world are actually more or less in touch with or connected with a kind of, let's say, an invisible ocean of Veda, where the word Veda is used in the general sense of knowledge, as opposed to the narrower sense of, Rig Veda, Sama, Yajura, and Atharva Veda, Samhitas.
Mhm. Right.
And to me, there's something to be said here, because if we study these different traditions, we find there are deep insights, there are points of wisdom which we can agree with. So much is there, which we wouldn't want to say, oh, that's nonsense. No, there is so much. There may be many things that we wouldn't accept. For example, going back into the what's considered Vedic tradition proper, one of the 6 darshanas, astika darshanas, is yoga. And this yoga darshan, according to our 18th century Acharya, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, we do not accept the conclusion of this darshan, the philosophical conclusion. But the processes of practicing yoga that are described, no problem. In fact, a fair amount of what is described in Patanjali Yoga Sutra we can also find in Bhagavad Gita.
Right.
The point is we may not agree with a particular conclusion of some darshana, whether we call it astika or we call it not even nastika, but there can still be points of wisdom, points of insight. And where is that wisdom, insight coming from? Well, if we use the word Veda in the broadest sense, we may want to say it's coming also from Veda. Even if their followers are saying, no, we reject Veda. What they're rejecting is a specific corpus which is shrunk down from, according to Jiva Goswami, from the original. And what they're especially rejecting, it seems, at least the Buddhist tradition, is they're rejecting the sacrificial tradition because of the excesses that were being practiced of the animal killing.
Yeah.
So the question, who do we follow, who do we accept as authority to interpret? Well, another way maybe of getting at this, but again, it may not be interesting for the hardcore naturalist, but if we go to our Narottam Das Thakur's statement, Sadhu Shastra Guru Vakya Hridoye Koryo Aikya Satatam Vasibo Prema Mache. He says that the words of the sadhus, the Shastra, and the Guru, Hridoye Korya Aikya, having become an Aikya, a singularity, a one clear message or vision in my heart, Satatam Basibo Prema Maje, I will constantly float in the ocean of prema, amidst prema. Now, we can turn that around and say, what's the test for interpretation, that it's good interpretation? Well, it's going to be something that leads to, and again, this is what Prabhupada would say, every religion is good, which is teaching love of God. So, if we take this, working backwards, that we start with the position of loving God, how do we get there? We get there possibly by some combination of teachings from, 3 kinds of sources, from Shastra, from Sadhu, from Guru.
Right.
But as I said, the hardcore naturalists will
They won't
say
accept.
they won't accept Shastra, they won't accept Guru, they won't accept Sadhu. But then we can ask, so who do you accept? Again, you're accepting authority.
I would say we accept a natural authority. I mean, the laws of nature, or so something like which I can verify, you can verify, anybody can in this world verify. It's objectively true. But then the question on the objectivity of this kind of verbal testimony, whether it is Shastra or Guru or Sadhu. So the issue lies over there. I mean, how do I trust them, whether they are true or whether they are leading to a true picture, whether I am able to understand it properly. So,
Mm.
what warrants their truth? So that is the issue probably for them.
Yeah, a little bit of faith has to be there in the
Yeah,
beginning, isn't it?
right, right.
Ado Shraddha, Srila Rupa Goswami says, in the beginning there needs to be some faith. And that faith comes, it's really a very personal thing.
Mm,
And I've seen that also with some of our, very qualified colleagues, Krishna Bhaktas, that they can often it can take a long period of time, but they can change the heart of someone just by their association.
mm,
And that's also the key that we always hear again
yeah,
and again, that it's really about association.
right. Yeah, true. So, just one more question about not related to this, but I mean, how much time do you have? It's almost
Well, maybe another 15 minutes or so.
okay. Okay, thank you very much. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe I can be more specific. So one thing that comes to my mind is often one of the many accusations that is presented by say a hardcore atheist is or even those who are kind of agnostic, they are kind of making a not so swift but slow transition to being a believer. So the question of circular reasoning, things like say the scripture is a statement of God, that's why we accept, and um, but then we believe because we believe on God because scripture says so.
Mm-hmm.
So then why do you, then somebody may say that why do you believe scripture, because it's the statement of God. It's kind of cyclic logic. So
Mm-hmm.
in formal logic, I mean the kind of practice
It
that is,
would be
yeah, it's wrong actually in
circular. Yeah.
circular. Yeah. So how does uh, our tradition maybe answers to such kind of allegations that the authenticity of Sabda Praman? So what
Yeah.
really, uh, is there a
Well,
logical?
a couple of points. One is, let's take in Bhagavad Gita, we have, um, as you said, the scripture is making this statement, here is God. And then, of course, we have in the Bhagavad Gita, it's in the form of the dialogue
Mm,
of Krishna speaking with Arjuna. And at one point, in the 10th chapter, Arjuna responds, or he proclaims, Param Dhamma, Param Brahma, Param Brahma, Param Dhamma, Pavitram, Paramam Padam, Purusham Shashvatam Divyam, Adidevam Ajam Vibhum. And then he goes on to cite other sages, other authorities. He's saying it's not just me who says this, it's also Asita and Devala and so on. And we read this, at least us in the West, like, okay, but who's Asita and who's Devala? I'd never heard of them before. It's assumed we know that these are great sages, okay, give the benefit of the doubt.
mm,
But the general principle is there, I think, that it's pointing to, it's hinting that there's some kind of consensus,
mm,
that it's not simply this one text that's making a claim, but that it's actually extending out beyond the text.
mm,
And, Prabhupada would say, even Shankaracharya
mm.
would say that
Yeah,
Narayana is beyond this material
right.
nature. So that's one point. Another point is you can think of it as circular logic, maybe strictly speaking, but from a spiritual perspective, it's not a circle; it's more of a spiral.
Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, a spiral means it's rising as it circles, and
Oh.
so you you come around. You come from one point A to point B and sort of back to point A, but actually you're not at point A. You're now at point C, uh, and you're rising. And what I mean by that is Shraddha, Ado Shraddha. The beginning is faith, and it's a leap of faith, as Søren Kierkegaard would put it, the Danish philosopher, 20th century, 19th. There's a point at which one has to make a leap. And that's a leap of trust. And then when you see a little bit of confirmation that, yes, this makes sense, and yes, this is somehow fulfilling, and yes, the words are making sense. I mean, just take the analysis of the dynamics of engagement of the senses and sense objects in the Bhagavad Gita. It's perfectly reasonable,
Right.
what Krishna is saying, that dhyato vishayan pungsa sangasteshu vajayate. I mean, we've all experienced it.
Many times.
Yeah,
Right.
and so many things he's saying which are just reasonable about this world. Then we build on that reasonableness and say, well, okay, let's take the next step. Let's keep going with that. And at each step there is a small leap, but we add up all the leaps of faith, and then what can come as the sum total of those jumps, if you like, is a very solid conviction.
Right.
And that is based on experience. It's not just empty. It's faith, not belief. Prabhupada would say, you can believe anything today, believe something else tomorrow, but this is based on experience.
Right.
But it's also based on a certain, what is called a kind of intellectual charity, where you give a benefit. It's called giving benefit of the doubt. That, okay, let me see, maybe this is possible. Prabhupada says that in his introduction to the Bhagavad Gita, that to benefit from reading the Bhagavad Gita, one needs to, at least theoretically, accept the claim that Krishna is God and the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Yeah. So it's saying, okay, let's allow that as an intellectual, as a thought experiment, if you like, and see where it takes us. But if someone is not willing to even take, one step, then you can argue until you're blue in the face.
That's why probably the evil is there. By God's grace, evil is imposed upon the living entity so that someday he may turn to him.
Yes. Well, that's explained by Jiva Goswami in his Tattva Sandarbha, that when Maya, or when it's said in the Bhagavatam that Maya is embarrassed to come before Krishna, that this Maya is actually doing her service of creating fear in the conditioned soul, and that fear forces the conditioned soul to turn toward the Lord.
Yeah.
So yeah, you could say that would be a reason, an explanation of what we're calling evil.
Yeah. So maybe one last question from my side. For a person who is he has become little favorable towards spiritual path of any sort, and he's trying to follow a particular path, and so there when he encounters, the first thing probably he encounters is the scriptures. So the issue of when he reads the scriptures, so there are two ways. One is either he literally accepts the words word by word, the meanings, or maybe he tries to read the mind of the author or one who has compiled, or with a full faith that whatever is written is 100% perfect. It's only me that I'm not able to understand the right meaning. Which is the literal statements are true, but I'm not able to figure it out. But then there is other way that maybe these literal statements are just the symbols. Maybe there is a hidden meaning, something
There's
totally obscure.
figurative.
Yeah. So, which of the two approaches which of these two hermeneutical approaches is a proper way recommended of own pros and cons?
Yeah, this is it's discussed in Chaitanya Charitamrita in Adi Lila chapter 7, where Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is meeting with the sannyasis in Varanasi. And this is one of the basic points that he's making, is that we take the literal meaning so long as it makes sense.
And this also varies from time, place. May be true now, may not be true after 100 years. Is that also?
That's not part of what he's discussing there. I mean, they're discussing Vedanta, which is understood to be, not subject to Desha Kalapatra. Yeah. But the tradition recognizes that statements may not make sense if they're taken literally, and so they can be taken figuratively, or indeed they can be taken poetically. And the famous example is Gangayam Goshaha, the village on the Ganga. Cannot mean that there's a village floating on the Ganga.
Right.
And so it must mean a village on the bank of the Ganga. But what is the significance of that is the dhvani, the suggestion, the poetic suggestion that that there are pleasant breezes blowing, and so this is a very pleasant place to be. It's not even mentioned in any one of the words, Gangayam Gosha, but it's implied. And so the entire, actually the whole of Vedic Shastra, especially the Bhagavatam, is full of such meanings, for which indeed it's very valuable to have the elucidation of the interpreters we recognize as qualified, the acharyas. And in that way, there can be a very rich understanding. And it doesn't have to be that it's either literal or figurative or, simply giving a suggestion. Example is with the childhood pastimes of Krishna, killing various demons in Vrindavan, and we find our previous Acharya, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, giving allegorical interpretations for each one of the demons as representing various anarthas in the heart, which are then destroyed by Krishna. He is, when he makes these allegorical interpretations, he's not denying, he's not thereby saying, it's not that, there was no such demon and there was no Krishna who killed the demon. No, he's saying there was the demon and there was Krishna who killed the demon. And in addition, we can appreciate, we can meditate on this pastime for our benefit as a way of purifying the heart from the various anarthas.
Yeah, right. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry for the participants that I couldn't take up your questions. Maybe one question from participant side. Would that be okay, Maharaj?
Okay, maybe with a short answer.
Yeah, very short answer. Yeah. Anybody having any burning question would like to ask?
burning question.
Yeah. Not the purpose of burning us, but for having a quick answer. Somebody is raising. Siddharth is raising his hand. So please go ahead quickly. We have very short time.
Or he can speak.
Yeah.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji, Dandot Pranam.
Hare Krishna.
Prabhuji, just a second. Yes. Prabhuji, I just want to develop a book reading habit, and today I started with a book, Brahmacharya in Krishna Consciousness. So I came across this verse, as long as living entity is not completely self-realized, as long as he is not independent of the misconception of identifying with his body, which is nothing but a reflection of the original body and senses, he cannot be relieved of the conception of duality, which is epitomized by the duality between men and women. Thus, there is every chance that he will fall down because his intelligence is bewildered. So it is very difficult. Like, I'm not able to understand this, Prabhuji. Why this? Like in earlier days, the culture was followed. Like a man and woman, they are living anyone cannot even see. But now the society is very different. We have abandoned that culture. So I think this verse is related to that. Can you please throw some light?
I can try. Yes, one issue is changes of, let's say, cultural and social behavior over time through the centuries. That's one issue. And the other is the more transcendent principle, which I think is being emphasized in what you read. And to the social and cultural practices, we can just say that the idea of separation, of various sorts of separation between the sexes, was a kind of realism, a kind of recognition that we all have this problem. And the problem is that we are overwhelmed by this duality. And the reason we're overwhelmed is because of identification with our physical bodies. So just recognizing that that's the reality, the social system was meant to set up boundaries of various sorts, to restrict, to control, to restrain, and to help us to practice restraint with the aim of ultimately realizing our spiritual nature, to become free from mundane attractions. And so I guess what you're saying is, it seems like these boundaries have largely fallen away. And yes, that's very much true in so many cultures now, including India, influenced maybe a lot by the West. But where one kind of boundary is broken down, I think we can be sure that other sorts of boundaries will make themselves manifest, and that can happen in ways that we may not be able to anticipate. What I mean by that, just more specifically, is we saw in recent decades the sudden appearance of this disease called AIDS, which seemed to be a kind of backlash from material nature, saying, you can't just go on mixing freely like this without there being some consequence. Yeah, that's what comes to my mind.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maharaj, for your patient answers and so enlightening.
Thank you.
Of course, I have many more questions to ask, but
Yeah.
in a time, maybe on some later occasion.
Yes, we can meet another time. You had suggested in your message, but I just wanted to say I need to wait and see
sure.
how my schedule goes. So after some time, you can contact me again and we can see.
Sure.
All right.
Thank you so much. I'll be in touch with you for a later occasion.
Yeah.
So we
Yes.
are eagerly looking forward for your kind association. These two sessions were really,
My thanks to you again for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much. We are really so indebted to you for your taking out so much of time for us. We are so thankful to you. Thank you so much, Hare Krishna.
Hare
And
Krishna.
thank you to all our participants also. I see in our participant list Brahmatirtha Prabhu also. So Prabhuji guides us on many occasions. So thank you very much, Prabhuji, for kindly joining us. Hare Krishna.